I've been told about this being called Towa-san ever since I was a child. I always heard that Towa-san only appears to you when you slack off or get lazy. Apparently, Towa-san has been in my region for ages, perhaps being sheltered there? And my parents said they had been helped by him many times in the past. As for Towa-san's characteristics, he looks like an ordinary middle-aged man. He only appears in front of people when they're slacking off or being lazy. It's not just children who can see him, adults can see him too. At first, he has no face, an opa-rabo, or faceless figure, but if you meet him repeatedly, his facial features gradually become visible. Well, when I was little, I truly believed everything I was told, but by around 3rd grade, I started thinking it was all pretty silly. And right around that same time, in 3rd grade, I ended up seeing Towa-san for the first time. I remember it clearly. I was skipping my calligraphy class because I didn't feel like going, and instead I hung out with a friend. When I finally went home, there was someone standing in front of the door. I thought maybe it was the mailman or someone trying to sell something, but they clearly weren't dressed for either job. Then I wondered if it might be our neighbor, Mr. Nakanishi, stopping by, but it didn't look like him either. That person didn't seem to notice me, so I said, "Hey, mister, what's up?" The moment he realized I was there, he took off running. I just stood there in shock, but when I thought back on it, I got the feeling that his face was completely white. That was my very first encounter with Towa-san. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about whether that person's face had been faceless or not. Towa-san came to mind, of course, but at the time I had completely forgotten the detail about he starts out as faceless, and if you meet him often, his features appear. So it didn't really register that it was him. Time jumped forward quite a bit. For a while, I didn't see Towa-san at all, and before I knew it, I was in high school. I was on the volleyball team, and I suffered pretty severe bullying from my seniors, to the point that I couldn't bring myself to go to school. Back then, people weren't as understanding about truancy as they are now. My parents hurled insults at me, and once a week, my homeroom teacher would practically force me into these grueling counseling sessions. To make matters worse, the kids who bullied me were honor students, which put me at a disadvantage from a social standpoint. But that's another story. Because we lived in the countryside, my parents told me to stay indoors unless I absolutely needed to go out, worried that if I were seen around, rumors would spread throughout the neighborhood. I didn't feel motivated to do anything anyway. I'd sleep until around noon, then stay up late on the computer. The typical life of a shut-in. That's when I encountered Towa-san for the second time. One day, after I woke up, I sensed someone else in my room. Panicking, I hid under my covers. I thought it might be one of my parents, but if it was already noon, they should have long since gone to work. It didn't feel like my grandma's presence, either. I started thinking maybe it was a burglar who had broken in, assuming no one was home. That seemed like the only logical explanation. So I worked up my courage and peered out through a small gap in the blankets. I saw a pair of legs. It looked like some hairy old guy's legs, maybe wearing shorts. I thought I caught a glimpse of a short, jersey-style pair of pants. The moment I saw that, I stopped looking. Suddenly, I had a flashback to the man I'd seen in 3rd grade. After about 20 seconds, it hit me, this had to be Towa-san. Honestly, at that point, I didn't even care how he'd managed to get into my room. I was just overwhelmed by the realization that Towa-san actually existed. He stood there in the same spot for about 10 minutes, and by the time I noticed again, he was gone. From that point on, I started seeing Towa-san frequently, almost every day, you might say. Faced with this, I genuinely wondered if I should tell my parents, because this was obviously trespassing. But my relationship with them at the time was as bad as it could get, and we barely spoke once a week as it was. So I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Not telling them then led to even worse problems down the line, but that's how it was at the time. The next day, I woke up as usual, and the second I opened my eyes, I sensed that presence in the room again. Reflexively, I hid under the blanket, and sure enough, he was there, just like the day before. Seeing him 2 days in a row really freaked me out. But thinking about that faceless face of his, I didn't have the courage to stand up to him. Eventually, like before, he disappeared after about 10 minutes. That went on for about a week. Strangely, I got somewhat used to his presence, and that worried me. By then, I'd come to understand that Towa-san probably wasn't a normal human being. But then I remembered, Towa-san shows up in front of people who are slacking or being lazy. Realizing that he saw me as a lazy good-for-nothing made me mad. Well, to be fair, I really was a shut-in at that point, But high school me wasn't about to be honest with myself. I tell myself, I'm only not going to school because I'm being bullied, or it's all my awful parents and terrible homeroom teachers' fault for not understanding. I kept telling myself that. About a month after he started showing up, I had an especially harsh session with my teacher that left me furious. I went to bed in a terrible mood, and sure enough, when I woke up the next day, there he was. My head was swirling with negativity, and instead of hiding under my comforter, I started hurling insults at him. I let loose every nasty word I could think of. I shouted, "I'm not lazy at all. So stop coming here." If anyone who couldn't see him had walked by, they would have assumed I was hallucinating on drugs or something. After I'd vented all my anger, my half-asleep eyes slowly began to focus. At the same time, I realized I was about to see the face of the faceless Towa-san. And there he was, exactly as I remembered him from childhood. But this time, he wasn't faceless. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man, neither particularly handsome nor especially strange. He had a completely normal face, except that he was wearing a completely deadpan expression, which honestly made him a bit scary. As soon as we made eye contact, he left the room. I scrambled to follow him, but he was already gone. After that, he stopped appearing in front of me. Maybe I'd shocked him too much with my outburst. Either way, I was just relieved to go back to waking up in peace. But that wasn't the end of my encounters with Towa-san. In fact, the real story started right after that. I ended up quitting high school, and while everyone else was heading off to university, I was still living the same shut-in life. I tried working a few times, but in our small town, word had spread that I dropped out of high school and became a recluse. Everywhere I worked, in the end, my relationships with people would turn sour, and I could never stick with a job. So there I was at 20 years old, on my birthday, with nothing to do. I was on my computer as always. All of a sudden, my bedroom door swung open. My parents were both at work, so there was no way they'd be home. Yet the door was definitely open. I wondered if the lock was broken, so I went over to check it, but found nothing wrong. I thought, what the heck was that? And headed back to my desk, where my computer was. That's when I saw him again. He was standing rigidly by my desk, staring straight at me. My mind went blank. I couldn't grasp what was happening. Our eyes met, and I couldn't look away, because I had this feeling that if I did, something terrible might happen. He stayed in that exact same spot, in that same posture, with that same expression, for about an hour. And then, just like before, he left. That moment confirmed it for me, my time with him was starting all over again. Sure enough, he began appearing to me from that day forward. But unlike before, he would show up at all different times and in all different places. His outfit was still the same, though. He once appeared when I was about to take a bath. Another time, I woke up in the morning, opened my eyes, and found him lying right next to me, wide awake. That time nearly gave me a heart attack, but he never harmed me, and it wasn't the typical horror movie scenario of some long-haired woman ghost. I'd reached a point where I could just shrug and think, well, that's Towa-san for you. However, at some point, I started noticing something strange. His face was gradually changing. Little by little, it looked like anger was taking hold of his expression. I thought, is he mad about something? And gradually came to the conclusion that, yes, he definitely looked angry. I started getting more and more nervous about encountering him. After I got my first cell phone, I ended up spending almost the entire day in bed. That way, unless he tried crawling in right next to me again, I wouldn't have to see him. And if worst came to worst, I figured, I could just yell at him like last time, and maybe he'd disappear again. As a result, I pretty much spent 20 whole days in bed. During that time, I did sense his presence in my room a few more times, but I was too busy messing around on my phone, looking at erotic pictures, and doing my thing to really pay attention. By the 19th day, though, my body started to protest. When I tried to stand up to go to the bathroom or get something to eat, I could barely manage it. My muscles had completely atrophied from lack of use, and not having bathed during all that time, I reeked. At that point, I realized I couldn't go on being at the mercy of Towa-san. I made up my mind to drive him away once and for all. On the 20th day, I decided to do whatever I could to run into him. Strangely enough, I didn't have to try very hard, he appeared right away. The moment I woke up, I felt that presence in the room. This was my chance. But then I heard some odd noise. It sounded like someone kicking something. Peering nervously out of the gap in my covers, I saw Towa-san kicking the wooden pillar in my room. It was solid wood and didn't even budge, but his foot was covered in what looked like blood, badly swollen and red. He kept kicking it, over and over, even though there was obviously nothing on the pillar to kick. I was horrified, and I let out a little "ack" in a shaky voice. He stopped kicking the moment he heard me. Then he turned his head in my direction. In a bizarre gesture, he lowered his face to my eye level. He had no face. It was blank again. Seeing that, I immediately pulled the covers over my head, and by the time I looked again, he was gone. When my parents came home, they were shocked to find blood spattered all over the house. They actually thought I might have killed someone and called the police, who came and searched the place. That was how I found out what had happened, too. The neighbors all gathered around. And at that point, there was no way I could say anything about Towa-san. Who knew what people would have thought? So I desperately tried to prove my innocence. The police searched our home, but they found nothing, and the matter was dropped. In the end, the conclusion was that I must have been half crazed, hurt myself, and scattered blood around. Naturally, after such a fiasco, I couldn't stay in that town anymore, so we moved away. Sorry for the long story. Indeed, as some of you might have guessed in the middle, there are parts where I might have been losing it back then. That's partly why I've never shared this story before. But I can say for sure that the stories about Towa-san, and the faceless figure I saw in 3rd grade, are real. As for all that blood, things got so jumbled that I can't really explain it anymore. That's basically the end of the main story. These days, I'm going to college. The catalyst was my parents practically begging me in tears, as well as the relentless harassment we faced in the neighborhood after that incident, which motivated me to get away. I've run into Towa-san only once since then. After starting university, I got a bit of the May blues in May, the feeling you get a month into something new and want to skip. One day, I thought, maybe I'll just blow off classes today, and for about an hour after waking up, I did nothing but lie around in bed. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt someone else in the room. I was certain. When I peeked out, I saw those legs I recognized so well, Towa-san. By then, I wasn't holding any grudge toward him about that previous incident. Instead, I almost felt happy to see him after so long, kind of like a positive feeling. The thought of ditching class completely vanished, and before I knew it, I was saying to him, "I'm going now." Then I heard him say, "Yeah," and the next thing I knew, he was gone. That was the first and last time I ever heard him speak. I've skipped class or my part-time job a few times since then, but he's never appeared again. Recently, I had a chance to meet up with a friend from my hometown, the only true friend who stuck by me despite my dropping out of high school and my breakdown. He said that lately, everyone's been buzzing about how Towa-san supposedly showed up on some TV drama. Of course, if he's still being sheltered in our region, there's no way he should be showing up on a show filmed in Tokyo. But I'm sure you've all guessed it, I'm probably the one responsible for letting Towa-san loose into the world. I can't tell my friend that, though. Towa-san is probably desperate to get back to where he belongs. Plus, there are way more lazy people in the city, so he might not be able to resist messing with them. If anyone else out there ends up going crazy because they met Towa-san like I did. Lately, I've been hearing more and more news stories about unemployed people killing their parents. I can't help wondering if Towa-san could be involved in some of those. I can't say for sure that he isn't. After all, I was that close to the edge myself.